this is the piece of the workshop that I find most, not just entertaining, but interesting. And so within every element, we can define that element's needs, okay? And its yields, its products or behaviors, and its intrinsic characteristics. And so the needs are basically, what does that element need in order to thrive or survive or function properly? Its products or behaviors, or what does it produce as a result of it being? And then its intrinsic characteristics, now this is specifically for a chicken, are the things that are specific to its specific breed. So is it cold tolerant? Is it rain resistant? Like some chicken feathers are more resistant to rain than others. Some work better in wet climates basically than in dry climates. There are intrinsic things that different breeds have and bring to the table. And so we want to understand what those are. Now, this example is very much of a biological system, like a chicken, which is awesome because biology is amazing. And if we're not working with biology, we're not sustainable or regenerative. However, you can do the same process with a natural gas boiler, with a solar panel, with a rain tank, with a cob oven, with a passive solar greenhouse, with a regular greenhouse, with a garden, with a cafe, with a business. It doesn't really matter. Everything that we design as humans has needs and yields. And the process of design is merely just a process of trying to match make, essentially. And so when we're doing design, we have the power of placement, but we don't always have the power of connection, which I'll get into a little bit more detail a little bit later. The chicken here has specific needs, and there's shelter, so it needs a place to live. Grit, so chickens don't have teeth. They've got a crop and a gizzard to help crush their food. It needs dust because it dust bathes. It needs water, air, food, and other chickens. It produces eggs, meat, feathers, manure, methane, CO2, scratching, foraging, flying, and fighting. There's a product or behavior or a yield that's missing here, and that's entertainment. Anybody that's had chickens knows that they are absolutely hilarious, and it should be on this product list there. I should make a little arrow that says entertainment. And then the intrinsic characteristics are going to be based on breed, the color of the chicken, climate tolerance, and breed-specific behavior. And so we can break every element down into these needs and yields. And this is the first step of good design, in my opinion, and the step that largely gets missed or ignored. So let's go through a specific example together. In front of you, you've got a compost pile. So let's go through the needs and yields of this compost pile. And I'm going to do it pretty quickly. I'm just going to flash up both the needs and the yields. And then we'll go through each one of them individually. So the needs of a compost pile include labor, oxygen, nitrogen or greens, but nitrogen can come in multiple different forms. It can also come in manure, phosphorus, potassium, microbes, water, carbon. If you don't know what I mean by carbon, things like wood chips, leaves, anything that's brown, mostly so, not including coffee grounds, of course, because coffee is actually really high in nitrogen. But basically, any good compost pile needs a balance between carbon and nitrogen. And generally speaking, we want that balance to be between 30-to-1 and 50-to-1. So 30-to-1 is what you're going to read about in most composting books. So if you have a composting pile that is smelly or slimy or is just not very nice to be around, most likely you've either got too much water in there or you've got too much nitrogen, not enough carbon. Very rarely do I see clients where they are putting enough carbon into the compost pile. And I should just mention that when you're putting carbon in, you want to make sure that the wood material that you're putting in is not allelopathic. So things like cedar mulch is not a good option. Ideally, you're going to be using wood mulch from if it's conifers, the conifer should be well digested. So it should be 6 months to a year old. And the way to test whether the wood chips are old enough is to literally just take a bunch of them and smell it. And if you can smell those conifer phenols coming off, so you know when pine chips are really new, they smell like pine, or spruce smells like spruce, or fir smells like fir. This is an indication that it's not ready for composting. Those phenols themselves are antifungal. and they're going to stop some of that. They're also antimicrobial. They're going to stop some of those decomposition pathways from occurring. And so you want to make sure that your wood chips are sufficiently aged before you start composting with them. If you can, though, deciduous trees are going to be better. So if you live in a climate where there's lots of deciduous wood mulch around, I highly recommend that. And literally put 50% of the pile in wood mulch. And if you're building a static heap like this one, you're going to want to make sure that you're putting in decent layers. So if you put in, 2 pounds or 3 pounds of greens from your kitchen, put in 2 to 3 pounds of wood mulch. Have the wood mulch right beside the compost so that it's really easy. You're not having to go for a long distance to go and get those wood chips. Other carbon sources include straw, leaves, like I mentioned. So there's lots of different ways that you can get carbon into this pile. Don't be shy about the carbon. If you put lots of carbon in and there's enough moisture in your opinion and it still doesn't get hot, you might be lacking on the nitrogen side of things. But it's way easier to add very small amounts of nitrogen than it is to have to come back from a stinky anaerobic pile. Basically, if your pile smells like any of the 4 gross smells, so I think it's puke, poop, what are the other ones? They're all amines, and I can't remember the butyric acid. Anyways, I can't remember what the 4 are, but if it smells bad and you don't want to be around it, add carbon. The yields of a compost pile are microbes, fertility, heat, carbon, nutrients, H2O, water holding capacity, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and micronutrients. Now, a lot of people think that compost is all about adding fertility or fertilizer into the garden, but it's not that you're wrong in saying that, but it's missing the most important point of compost. It's actually been proven now that the carbon that emerges as a result of the decomposition and compost, the end product of a compost, doesn't last more than 3 to 4 years in the garden. It actually off-gases into CO2, and so it's actually a very short-lived amendment, if you will. The actual thing that compost does, compost is basically yogurt for the soil. It's a probiotic. And if you are managing your soil properly, you'll be adding in a biodiverse amount of probiotics to the soil through the use of compost extracts, and compost teas. And this is the benefit of compost. You will get all the other nutrients as well, but the main benefit is the inoculation of plant roots. And if people are interested, potentially, and you remind me at the end, we can go through a little bit more about how plants get nutrient out of the soil, if that's something of interest. Somebody can make a comment at the end there. So there's a lot of needs and yields of this compost pile. And then when we bring it all together, the goal of a needs and yields analysis is trying to find the Venn diagram, or the intersection points between the 2 elements that make the compost and the chicken happier together. As I said earlier, good designers are matchmakers. And so the chicken produces manure. In that manure is a bit of H2O, not a lot, but a little bit. In its manure, there are microbes, there's potassium, there's phosphorus, there's nitrogen, there's labor. Chickens actually produce labor. And then as a yield, the compost itself produces microbes, fertility, heat. It produces micronutrients, and it produces bugs or grubs. And so you can see there's potentially some interesting synergy there. Now, I want to ask a question to you guys and see what your responses are. But when you're putting a compost pile on your property, where is the first place that you generally put your compost pile? Okay, so generally speaking, when I go onto a property, we typically find people's chicken coops as far away as possible from where they live, from their center of energy. And what I usually do as a consultant is I will go onto their property and I walk to the chicken coop, and then I walk to their compost heap, and I count the steps. And I'm a pretty big guy, and so I know that when I take a step, I'm taking a step that's about a yard or a meter long. Not quite, but almost there. And I count my steps, and then I ask the homeowner or the acreage owner, so how many times do you go to the compost heap every day? And they're like, oh, probably once a day. And you're going there and back. And what about the chicken coop? How many times are you going to the chicken coop every day. And they say, well, you know, every day I got to go collect the eggs, or maybe twice a day sometimes. And then, given that I'm an engineer, I pull out my smartphone and I calculate that out, and I divide it by 1,000 to determine how many kilometers they're walking per year. And sure enough, you know, they're walking a long distance, and sometimes it's really long. And inevitably, the homeowner will always say, you know, well, it's good exercise. And I'm like, well, do you have any hobbies outside of composting and chicken coops? And they say, well, yeah, but you know, I never have time to go mountain biking, or I never have time to go hiking in the mountains, or whatever, walk the dog, whatever your hobby or hobby is that you like to do to get exercise. I was like, well, what if we change the system around here so that we design some of the work out? And so here's your first saying for the evening. Work is a failure in design. Okay, so let that sink in a little bit. Now, it's not to say that there's no work in a permaculture system. There absolutely is. However, if you're having to do endless amounts of work, another saying a friend of mine uses, Dakota Cohen, is that, how does it go? Drudgery is the price of stupidity. So if you continue to do the same thing over and over again without changing the situation and things aren't getting better, you need to change your design. So we need to look at how to integrate these things, and we can see that the chickens want a lot of what the compost has to offer, and the compost wants a lot of what the chickens have to offer. Now, I need to know, or I need to give you guys another saying to think about, and this is really, really important. It's one of the most important sayings in permaculture, in my opinion, and that is, we want to do 100 hours of thinking for every hour of doing. And it's a little bit of a saying, and you're not necessarily always going to spend 100 hours thinking about every hour that you actually go and do something. But if you use it as a little bit of a guideline, I think it can inform your design a little bit. Whereas most people, what they want to do is do 100 hours of doing and 1 hour of thinking, and then they're constantly chasing their tail. And so what I want you guys to think about is, how can we apply this 100 hours of thinking for 1 hour of doing? And I have a story to tell you guys. A buddy of mine in Manitoba named Robert Guilford, amazing guy. He co-founded the Harvest Moon Society in southern Manitoba. I highly recommend checking it out if you're in Manitoba. It's an amazing place, amazing people. Decided that he was going to take this concept to reality. He wanted to actually observe something for a long period of time. And permaculture is all about observation, as you're starting to get a sense of. And so what he did was he actually sat down and he watched his chickens, and he said he watched them for 100 hours. He just kept watching them. And what he discovered is a really interesting behavioral pattern of chickens, which ended up saving him so much time. And so it really kind of brings this whole needs and yields and work is a failure in design and 100 hours of thinking and 1 hour of doing. And so what he noticed is that whenever chickens drink, they poop. And the reason that's important is that that observation allowed him to combine passive solar greenhouses and chickens together, which typically I would say is a no-no. The reason you typically don't put livestock into your passive solar greenhouse is because the manure and the urine that comes off of the livestock will produce ammonia gas, which can cause issues with your plants. As soon as plants detect the ammonia in the air, it actually burns their leaves. And so by doing this, he figured out why or when chickens poop, and then from there he used it to create a directive in order to better design his chicken coop. And the reason that this is kind of important is that how many people here have been into a chicken coop that is just the most disgusting thing you've ever been in? The minute you walk in, you want to get out of there. The reason chicken coops are disgusting is because people hate cleaning them. People hate the dust, they hate the smell, they hate the odor. And so a lot of times I go into chicken coops and they've just been completely ignored because somehow they think that if they ignore it, the problem will somehow magically just disappear. Well, what Robert Guilford did was he put the chicken waterer right over top of the roost. And so whenever the chicken came in to drink inside of their little coop, they also got to get a drink of water, and then their poop fell down into one place. And so he was able to run his coop for an entire half to even a full year without changing the bedding pack on the bottom because it was not full of manure. Just through that simple observation that they pooped every time they drank. Now, there's a couple of other things that came out of it. He attached a passive solar greenhouse to the chicken coop, so the chickens were keeping the passive solar greenhouse warm, which again, there's a few things there that you have to be cautious about before you go and do that. He provided artificial light for his passive solar greenhouse, specifically for his tomatoes, which also gave the chickens some artificial light, which allowed them to continue producing eggs throughout the winter. So just some interesting ideas there. And I don't want you to take this as something you should necessarily go and do. I want you to use it more as an example of how you can use observation in order to make better design. And this concept of 100 hours of thinking and 1 hour of doing. So what if instead of putting our chicken coop and our compost piles on odd ends of the property, really far away, we figured out how to combine them together? Now, I want to ask one more question of compost. Why is it that you guys think that compost piles go to the end of the property? So if you have a smelly compost pile, you're probably not very good at composting, because if you have your compost pile near your house and it smells, what are you going to do about it? You're not going to live with the smell. So some people will move it away, and other people who are a bit more determined will figure out how to compost properly, because properly composting material shouldn't have an odor to it. So just something to think about. Smell is just a feedback mechanism. It's giving you information, and our job as designers is to take that information and put it to productive use, to figure out what that information is trying to tell us, and to anaerobic, Josh, totally, to figure out how to better utilize that information and put it to productive use and get better at what it is that you're doing. It's just a feedback mechanism. So let's go to the next slide here. So composts, compost needs, chickens need food, they need microbes, they need bugs, they yield feathers, manure, scratching, foraging. Yeah, they produce eggshells. You could also say that they produce bones as well. There's lots of stuff that comes off the back end of a chicken system, and that can all be put to productive use into a compost system. So my question to you guys, and I'm not saying necessarily this is how you should go and design a chicken coop, I'm just using this as an analogy or a metaphor for how we can create better design. And so the ultimate chicken coop, why wouldn't we have a compost heap on the bottom with a trap door in it, a chicken nipple right here, so chickens could come into the chicken coop, come and drink from it. Their manure would all concentrate right here. When we're done, we happen to know that shit rolls downhill. And so when, instead of moving it out of the chicken coop, we just let it go down. We can put our food scraps down here with our carbon, and guess who's going to come down and manage it? The chickens will. We can have a rain tank on the side, which will capture water from the roof. As this tank gets full, or this tank needs water, we can pump it back up to here. So we've got gravity feed. We can run that pump off of a solar array. Even just a tiny little solar panel is all you need. We can have an automatic chicken door, an operable window, and it can kind of all come together. And so that the compost heat through the winter will help to keep the greenhouse warm. The chicken manure will keep the compost active. The chicken, or the compost, will actually get managed by the chickens. The trap door itself, we can have an opener on the front, a big, huge plug that comes out of the chicken coop. So we just take our rake, we pull a pulley, pull up the hinged roost, and then push with a rake all the carbon down onto the material, and then fill it back up again. We just have to think about things a little bit more conscientiously. And when we do that, we can really design a lot of the work out of the system, essentially. And so work is a failure in design. And this is an example of what we can actually do in order to reduce the amount of work that we're currently doing, just by taking a little bit more time and thinking about design.